When archaeologists started excavating in Anyang, China in the 1920s, they found a number of artifacts that had survived for thousands of years, buried in the ground. Bronze pots, clay jars, and jade jewelry. They also discovered something special, the early stages of the Chinese writing system, and one exhibition here in Washington is displaying all of those findings. I met Keith Wilson at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art here in Washington, D.C. He is the museum's curator of ancient Chinese art and organized the Anyang, China's Ancient City of Kings exhibition. I was in Xi'an years back. Of course, everybody goes there, and you're just you marvel at the archaeology, the history, and Anyang, I wasn't that familiar with it, but it's kind of it has kind of that rich tapestry, that rich story as well, doesn't it?
In many ways, it's more important than the discoveries that have happened over the last few decades in Xi'an. Anyang was really the birthplace of Chinese archaeology. It's where the archaeological practice, modern archaeological practice, really began. So it was, in a way, an archaeological laboratory that prepared the way, trained the archaeologists that ultimately trained the archaeologists that worked in the Xi'an project. But thinking back to the early 20th century and the birth of archaeology in China, the work at Anyang was pivotal and not only proved the existence of an early historic period in China, but also, as I say, proved as a training ground for archaeology in China.
It's fascinating that farmers were coming across some of this stuff initially, right? And that kind of led to these discoveries. Can you walk us through that story?
Sure. The incidental discovery of artifacts is a very old story in China, going back centuries, if not millennia. Chance discoveries happen all the time. In the case of Anyang, what was important was the chance discovery of bits of bone and turtle shell that had strange markings on them. These objects were making their way to the marketplace, being used, actually ground up to make powdered drugs. And it was a scholar who happened to notice these objects before they were pulverized into medicine, and realized that these strange markings were actually ancestral forms of Chinese writing that led people to understand that this was coming from a place of great historic importance. The scholars and ultimately the archaeologists traced these objects back to the Anyang site, and that's what led to the first kind of survey of the site in 1928, and ultimately the commencement of formal excavations there in 29.
Wilson has a PhD from Princeton University in Chinese art and archaeology. He served as curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Since joining the Smithsonian Museum in 2006, he launched a comprehensive digital catalog dedicated to the museum's early jade collections. This is a rich treasure for those who want to come and look at the exhibit, but it's also kind of a rich story of collaboration between the United States and China, which, of course, we've hit kind of some bumps on the road in recent years. But can you talk about the benefits of that and what that's been like for you?
Sure. The reason why I selected Anyang as the subject for a centennial exhibition. This is the 100th anniversary of the Freer. The work at the Anyang site was collaborative early on. In fact, the Freer Gallery of Art was involved in funding the early excavations at the site in 1929. In thinking about the current geopolitical situation and thinking also about the Freer's 100th birthday, I thought that shedding light on this site and the way that it brought Chinese institutions and American institutions, the Freer, the Smithsonian, together for scholarly collaboration was kind of an important message for today, showing that Over the years, there have been these great opportunities and warm relations between colleagues working on important projects together.
The exhibition gives a glimpse into what life was like in ancient Anyang. It features over 200 artifacts, including ceremonial weapons, ritual bronze vessels, and chariot fittings. This is truly amazing, isn't it?
This gallery is all about royal objects from the early Anyang period, from the first few decades, probably 1250 to about 1200 BCE, so over 3,000 years ago. This kind of white ceramic has only been found in royal context, so we think that this is probably a particular kind of ceramic that was only made for use by the royals.
And putting this together, and this whole structure, I mean, that's a story in itself, isn't it?
Right. The object came to us intact like this, but it's hard to imagine that a ceramic buried in the ground that was 3,200 years old was intact. So we x-rayed it, and we discovered that, in fact, it had been reassembled from fragments. But the x-ray reveals that about 95% of the object is original, so very little film material.
And we're looking at a lot of vases, ornamental pieces. Jade obviously was big back then, still is, of course, today.
Right. One thing about Chinese material culture is that it's all primarily functional objects. They're made for use. So the objects that you mentioned as vases are actually containers that were used in ritual banquets that were offered to deceased family members. So containers for wine, containers for food, also objects for cooking or warming those objects. So all very practical. We look at them today, and especially in a museum setting where they're on display on pedestals with plexiglass, we appreciate them as art objects, but they were very important objects for particular usages in antiquity.
This one, fantastic. Everybody loves it, right?
Everybody loves it. It's one of our most popular objects, and I think everybody can see why. It sure looks like Shrek, and designed well before the movies. These two objects, probably a water pitcher and a water basin, are coming from the middle Anyang period, so produced around 1100 BCE, and made for those kind of ritual banquets that I mentioned. These would have been part of a cleansing ritual. So imagine the basin full of water. What you would see looking into the basin, but beneath the water is this serpent that's wound around the inside of the basin looking up at you. The motif is very similar to what we're seeing on the picture, the spouted object, a kind of semi-human dragon form.
And we're going to go in here. Bells were important.
Right. The little bells, like the two here at the front of the case, are typically found in Anyang burials and in elite tombs in the Anyang area. The mouth upright bell with the stem doesn't have a clapper inside, so it's thought that bells like this were intended to be handheld, almost like handbells, and played with mallets on the outside. When they're found in Anyang burials, they're typically found in groups of 3 or 5 of graduated sizes, so they produce different tones, different musical notes, probably used to perform music.
The city of Anyang, which is about 300 miles south of Beijing, existed for just 2 centuries, but in that time, it grew to cover over 24 square miles, or just over 36 kilometers, which is about half the size of Miami. How difficult is it to understand what was written? Can you kind of walk us through that?
Sure. The writing that appears on artifacts found at the Anyang site, so that's, 3,000 years ago, they are ancestral forms of the current Chinese language. It's an unbroken tradition, which makes it a particularly important linguistic tradition. When first discovered in the 1920s, Certain graphic forms, certain characters were easily recognizable compared to their current form written in Chinese today, the 21st century. Many were not. And it's taken 100 years of philological research to allow those scholars of historic writing to identify many of the characters that appear on the oracle bones and the bronze inscriptions found at Anyang. I think now it would be fair to say that we can probably recognize and transcribe probably 80% of the writing that has been found at the Anyang site.
So, given that, as you're putting this together, do you take yourself back in time and think about what it was like to live back then and what life was like?
We wanted the show to both chronicle the importance of burial, because it's through tombs that we know so much about ancient cultures. But not only to fixate on death, but also to, imagine what living in Anyang might have been like for the Shang people. Our imagination has been assisted by current archaeological practice over the last 15, 20 years. Archaeology at the Anyang site, still ongoing after 100 years, has focused more on the infrastructure of the city, the roads, the canals, the habitation areas, the neighborhoods, the factories. All of this helps us imagine not only what death was like and to die in Anyang, but also, maybe more importantly, to help us imagine what living in Anyang would have been like for the Shang people.
Among the most important findings in Anyang is the tomb of Fu Hao, which was discovered in 1976. Fu Hao was a consort of the king, Wu Ding. Her tomb was found in the Shang Royal Crypts. It's the only burial site that has been found in pristine condition. Fu Hao, a fascinating woman. I think one of the things I noticed in researching this is that a lot of hairpins as well. I mean, there was a lot there with her, right?
Right. As I say, as a museum person, what makes her most interesting to me is she was a collector. In her tomb, among the hundreds of jades that she took with her, were objects that in her lifetime were already several thousand years old. Somehow those objects had come to her, and the accumulation of those objects suggests that here we are, 3,000 years ago already, Chinese collectors were collecting things that were thousands of years before their own lifetime. So as I say, being able to look at a tomb and detect a historical personality, an individual character is what's exciting for someone like me today looking back.
Doesn't hurt that she has some of your characteristics too, right? I mean,
exactly. Collector at heart.
Yeah, but there's another piece to her that's interesting, is that she was a warrior. I mean, we don't kind of think that way.
No, I mean, both as a queen, thinking of a queen on the battlefield, that's a little unusual, but especially as a woman warrior 3,000 years ago, the oracle bones that I mentioned that concern her life concern not only her success in childbirth, a more expected topic for a queen, but also concern her success on the battlefield. There are records of her leading large battalions into battle, among the largest armies that we know of from late Anyang time. So, it's very surprising to see the role that she played in her own time.
The written records in Anyang are the oldest surviving examples of writing found in China. The display shows oracle bones, which were used by ancient seers to predict the future. They wrote on animal bones with early Chinese characters that are still used today. Keith, one of the things that I love about my job is I don't ever talk to people who have professions. I talk to people who have passions, and it's obvious you have a passion about this. What's the best part of your job?
Coming to work and being able to work with objects in storage, being able to be in front of objects with colleagues, getting their points of view, contributing to my study and understanding of the things that we're looking at. Being able to be in a museum with that direct contact with objects is really the best part of my job.
Talk to me about your inspiration to become so interested in Chinese art. What was it?
It's part of my history, and not getting a lot of Asian education in my public high school. So when I got to college, that first semester I took a Chinese Civ class, and the rest is history. I kind of got into the Chinese time machine and progressively studied earlier and earlier periods of Chinese history until I realized that that's really what I wanted to do for my living, my profession.
Visiting China was kind of a yearly experience for you. Can you talk to me about that and first the difficulties and where you would like us to be going?
Well, in organizing a project like this, I really always have in my mind two audiences. There's the local American audience, and in many ways I might be introducing a new Chinese topic to an American audience, and hopefully contributing to the relationship between Chinese and American people. But I'm also thinking about Chinese audiences and, presenting Chinese subjects, Chinese objects to American audiences, making sure that I'm sensitive to the Chinese cultural point of view, and in that way contributing to Chinese appreciation for American interest in China. Museums as public organizations, public institutions, stand as kind of a pivot between China and the U.S. in this case, and making sure that we do it right so that it enriches experiences for American visitors and helps Chinese audiences understand that Americans are interested in Chinese culture, interested in China's history, is an important part of what I do.
Yeah. What are some of the things they said?
That they're learning from the show.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so if an exhibition like this in an American institution about remote Chinese history 3,000 years ago can help Chinese understanding of their own cultural past, I'm gratified by that. I think where I noticed that most was in the last gallery of the show, where we talk about contemporaneous ancient Chinese bronze-using cultures that coincided with Anyang and the late Shang dynasty, talking about regionalism in ancient China. I think that's a subject that was new. I'm learning was new to many of our visitors. So again, a point of gratification for me.
Let me ask you a final question about history. China had such a rich, thousands of years. Here, the U.S. has been around for a couple hundred. How do you see history as you look at it, this silo versus this one?
As a person who's interested in ancient cultures and ancient Chinese culture in particular, a motivation for me in doing this show was helping to illustrate to American audiences just the incredible richness of ancient history in China. I think, people are much more accustomed to ancient Egypt and the Mediterranean world. Ancient China, Bronze Age China, Neolithic Stone Age China is still not as well known. So I hope that through a project like this, people can see that China had this incredibly important prehistoric and historic culture. And given the quality of the objects, the technology that's revealed through a close inspection of the artifacts, it shows just how incredibly accomplished technically the Chinese artists and artisans were 3,000 years ago. So I'm hoping that it contributes to the general American understanding of early history and even prehistory around the world.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.